The midday sun beat down on the crowded downtown street. People hurried along the sidewalk, most too preoccupied with their own lives to notice the man sitting near the entrance of a trendy coffee shop. His clothes were torn and dirtied from days, maybe weeks, of living on the streets. His hands were calloused, his skin darkened not only by his race, but also by the sun that had been his constant companion. His eyes, however, still carried a spark. Though small, it was a light that hadn't yet been extinguished by the cruelty of life. His name was Solomon, and he'd been homeless for over a year. Once he had a job as a mechanic. He had a home, friends, and hope for the future. But all of that changed when the factory he worked for closed down without warning. The layoffs were immediate, and like many others, Solomon found himself on the streets with nowhere to turn. No one wanted to hire a black man over 50, and especially one without a formal education. As people passed, Solomon held out a hand, barely uttering a word. He had learned long ago that pleading didn't help. The looks people gave him were enough to keep his mouth shut. Sometimes it wasn't the rejection that hurt, it was the disgust. The way people's eyes slid over him, as though he were nothing more than the garbage littering the sidewalk. "Hey, get a job, loser!" Solomon flinched as a voice rang out. He looked up to see a group of teenagers standing in front of him, led by a tall, fair-skinned boy who couldn't have been more than 18. The kid's clothes screamed privilege. Designer sneakers, expensive sunglasses perched on his head. He kicked the small cup Solomon had placed in front of him, scattering the few coins he had managed to collect. "Why don't you do something useful with your life instead of begging for my money?" The boy sneered, laughing as his friends snickered beside him. Solomon remained silent. He dealt with this kind of treatment before. Countless times, in fact. He lowered his eyes, hoping they would get bored and leave. But the boy wasn't done. "Seriously, what's wrong with you people?" he continued, gesturing broadly as though addressing the whole street. "Always asking for handouts. You probably don't even want to work, right?" The words stung, but Solomon kept his calm. What good would it do to argue? These kids were living in a different world, one he had never been a part of. Just then, an older woman stepped out of the coffee shop, her gray hair pinned back neatly. She paused, noticing the scene unfolding in front of her. "Michael!" she shouted, her voice sharp with reprimand. "What are you doing?" The boy, Michael, turned to face her, clearly startled. "Nothing, Mom," he muttered, his bravado fading as his friends exchanged awkward glances. "Get in the car," she ordered, her voice cold. Michael's face flushed with embarrassment, but he obeyed, retreating to a shiny black SUV parked nearby. The woman watched him go before turning her attention to Solomon. Her expression softened, but there was something else in her eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or shame. "I'm so sorry for my son's behavior," she said quietly, kneeling down to pick up the scattered coins. He doesn't understand." Solomon offered her a tired smile. "It's all right, ma'am. Happens more often than you'd think." But the woman seemed uneasy, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the coins back in his cup. After a moment, she reached into her purse and pulled out a $50 bill, pressing it into his hand. "Please take this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "And thank you." Solomon furrowed his brow in confusion. "Thank me?" Her eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. "You don't know who I am, do you?" He glanced at her again, unsure of what she meant. She looked vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place her face. "I'm Evelyn Carter," she said, as if that name alone should explain everything. When it didn't, she sighed. "Years ago, before my father passed away, he told me something. He told me that you, Solomon, were the reason he was able to survive." Solomon's heart skipped a beat. "Your father?" Evelyn nodded, wiping away a stray tear. "Yes, my father, Robert Carter. He was a soldier during the Korean War. He never told anyone the full story, not until the end. But he said there was a black man, who saved his life when he was stranded behind enemy lines. A man who didn't have to help him, but did anyway. And that man was you." Solomon's mind raced, flashes of the war surfacing in his memory. He had saved many lives back then, soldiers like Robert who had been caught in the crossfire. But he hadn't thought about those days in years, let alone connected it to the people walking the streets now. "I never knew," Solomon whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know he made it home. Evelyn smiled sadly. He did. Because of you. And because of you, I got to grow up with a father. I got to hear his stories, learn from him, love him. So yes, thank you. Solomon swallowed hard, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He had never expected to hear those words, not after all this time. Evelyn stood slowly, glancing over at her son, who was watching from the car. I wish I could say Michael understands what you did for our family, but he doesn't. He's, he's young, and he's foolish. But I'm going to make sure he learns the truth. She hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but then simply offered him another small, sad smile. Thank you, Solomon, for everything. As she walked away, Solomon watched her go, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. He stared down at the $50 bill in his hand. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the knowledge that his sacrifice, his life, had made a difference. One that no amount of hate, cruelty, or ignorance could ever take away. For the first time in a long time, Solomon felt seen, not just as a homeless man on the street, but as a human being who had lived, fought, and survived. And as he watched Evelyn and her son drive away, he couldn't help but hope that one day, Michael would understand too. As Evelyn and her son drove away, Solomon found himself sitting in silence, absorbing the moment. The street had quieted, and the usual hum of the city seemed distant as he reflected on the conversation that had just taken place. The memories of the war, long buried beneath years of hardship, resurfaced in vivid flashes, images of young soldiers, desperate for survival, calling out for help. He remembered Robert Carter now, a fellow soldier stranded in enemy territory. Solomon had risked his life to save him, not because of the color of their skin, but because in the face of death, they were simply two human beings fighting for a chance to live. But after the war, Solomon returned to a world that did not reward him for his bravery. Instead, he found a country still divided, a place where men like him, black men, were not seen as heroes, but as second-class citizens. He had hoped things would change, but time had only deepened the scars of racism and inequality in America. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, Solomon's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A familiar figure approached, Michael, the boy who had mocked him earlier. His posture was different now, slumped with guilt, and his eyes darted nervously as he came closer. Hey, Michael muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. He didn't look at Solomon directly, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what I said earlier. It wasn't cool. Solomon raised an eyebrow, studying the boy's face. The arrogance from earlier was gone, replaced by shame and confusion. He could tell that Michael was wrestling with something deeper than just a simple apology. Why are you apologizing, son? Solomon asked gently. Your mother put you up to this? Michael shifted uncomfortably, kicking at a small stone on the sidewalk. She told me some things about you, about what you did for my granddad. Solomon nodded slowly, understanding now. It was clear Evelyn had explained the truth to her son, but Michael still seemed to be grappling with it. I didn't know, Michael continued, his voice breaking. I didn't know who you were. I just saw, you know, a homeless black man, Solomon finished for him. Michael winced, the truth of it hitting him hard. Yeah, he admitted, his eyes finally meeting Solomon's. I guess I just thought, I don't know what I thought. I've been raised to believe people should pull themselves up, work hard, but I didn't stop to think that maybe it's not that simple. Solomon watched the boy, his heart softening. He could see the conflict in Michael's face. This was a young man who had been raised in privilege, surrounded by people who likely never had to worry about survival. He was struggling to reconcile the lessons he had been taught with the reality in front of him. You're right, Michael, Solomon said after a long pause. It's not that simple. I've worked hard my whole life. I had a job, a home, everything. But sometimes life takes things from you, no matter how hard you work. Sometimes it's not about how much effort you put in. It's about the world we live in. And for people like me, that world isn't always fair. Michael seemed to absorb the words, nodding slowly. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped, as though unsure of what to say next. After a moment, he pulled out his wallet and handed Solomon a few bills, though his hands shook as he did so. "Here," he said awkwardly. "I know it's not much, but I want to help." Solomon glanced at the money, then back at the boy. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. It wasn't the money that mattered, it was the gesture, the beginning of understanding. Solomon reached out, not for the bills, but for Michael's hand, gripping it firmly. "You don't owe me anything, Michael," Solomon said softly. "What I want from you is to remember this moment. Remember what you learned today. Don't forget that people, no matter where they come from or what they look like, are worth more than what you see on the surface." Michael swallowed hard, nodding as he pulled his hand back, tucking the money away again. "I will," he promised, his voice barely a whisper. Solomon watched him for a long moment before letting go of the tension that had gripped his heart since the boy's cruel words earlier. "That's all I ask." The two stood in silence for a moment longer before Michael muttered another quiet apology and walked away, leaving Solomon alone once more. The sky had grown darker, the streetlights flickering to life, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. But despite the fading light, Solomon felt a sense of hope he hadn't experienced in years. The conversation with Evelyn, the remorse in Michael's eyes, these moments were small, but they were enough to remind him that change was possible. It wouldn't come overnight, and it wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, there was hope for the next generation. Days passed, and life on the streets continued as usual. Solomon returned to his spot outside the coffee shop, his familiar routine of sitting quietly, watching the world move around him. He didn't expect to see Michael again, and honestly, he didn't need to. The boy's apology had been enough. But one afternoon, as Solomon sat beneath the awning, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Solomon recognized it immediately. It was Evelyn's car. The door opened, and Michael stepped out, carrying a large duffel bag over his shoulder. His expression was different this time, determined, almost eager. "Hey," Michael said, walking up to Solomon with a sheepish grin. I brought you something." Solomon looked at him curiously as Michael unzipped the bag and began pulling out items, clothes, shoes, and a thick woolen blanket. "I know it's not much," Michael said quickly, his voice laced with nerves, "but I figured it's getting colder out, and I thought maybe you could use some of this stuff." Solomon blinked in surprise, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Michael," he said sincerely, reaching out to take the blanket. "This means a lot." Michael hesitated, then sat down beside Solomon on the pavement, his posture awkward but genuine. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he admitted, his voice quiet, "about how life's not always fair. And I realized I've been really lucky. I've had a lot handed to me, and I never thought about what it would be like to lose everything." Solomon nodded, allowing the boy to process his thoughts. "I don't want to be that person," Michael continued, his voice firm, "the kind who just judges people without knowing their story. I want to do better." Solomon smiled warmly, feeling a deep sense of pride for this boy who had once mocked him. "You're already doing better," he said softly, "and that's all anyone can ask for." They sat there for a while, two unlikely companions, watching the city move around them. Michael's phone buzzed with texts from his friends, but he ignored them, choosing instead to stay a little longer, talking to Solomon, learning from him. The boy who had once seen Solomon as nothing more than a beggar now saw him as a human being, someone with a story worth hearing. And in that quiet moment, Solomon realized that maybe his greatest impact wasn't saving lives on the battlefield. Maybe it was moments like this, teaching the next generation what it truly meant to be human.